Hello. So this video is going to be about the concept of fetal circulation, and I'm going to use an animation to show how the blood flows through the fetus's body as it's developing. So, as you may know, the fetus receives oxygenated and nutrient-rich blood from the placenta, and this blood makes its way into the fetus's body using a blood vessel known as the umbilical vein. Now, as the umbilical vein courses through the fetus's body, it's going to come across the liver. Now, keep in mind that the fetal liver is not developed yet, so there's no reason for the blood to stop here at the liver to be detoxified. Instead, the blood in the umbilical vein bypasses the liver using a shunt, highlighted here in black, known as ductus venosus. This allows the blood from the umbilical vein to go into the inferior vena cava. Now, as you may realize, the umbilical vein carries oxygenated blood and the inferior vena cava is carrying the oxygenated blood. So when these blood vessels merge, it forms some partially oxygenated blood. Then I'm going to depict this partially oxygenated blood as purple for the sake of this animation. Now, the rest of the inferior vena cava courses through as you would expect and drains into the right atrium of the fetal heart. Now, you'd expect that the blood in the right atrium will flow into the right ventricle and then into the pulmonary arteries and then into the lungs. However, since the fetal lungs are also not developed, there's no reason for the blood to go through to the lungs using the pulmonary arteries. So, instead, we'd want most of the blood to go into the aorta to be used for systemic circulation. For this reason, there is a hole between the atria of the fetal heart known as foramen ovale. So, most of the blood in the right atrium will make its way through the foramen ovale and go into the left atrium, and then into the left ventricle, and then into the aorta for systemic circulation. Now, there's also something that you should keep in mind is that although most of the blood goes through the foramen ovale, some of the blood goes into the right ventricle and then into the pulmonary artery. However, since we do not want the blood to flow through the pulmonary arteries completely and go to the lungs, since they're still developing, there is another shunt known as ductus arteriosus, highlighted here in black, which allows any of the blood that is pushed towards the pulmonary arteries to make its way into the aorta so that most of the blood can be used for systemic circulation using the aorta and its branches. Now, once the respiring tissues in the fetus's body have utilized the oxygen in the partially oxygenated blood, the deoxygenated blood will make its way up the veins and most of it will go into the inferior vena cava. However, some of this deoxygenated blood will go back to the placenta using umbilical arteries to become oxygenated, and this process will start over again. Now, just to recap, we begin with the umbilical veins carrying oxygenated blood into the fetus's body, and then we will come across the liver, which is not fully developed, so we need to bypass it. And for this, we use a shunt known as ductus venosus, which will allow the blood in the umbilical vein to drain into the inferior vena cava. And resulting from this is some partially oxygenated blood. Now, this blood will flow through the inferior vena cava and drain into the right atrium of the fetus's heart. From here, from the right atrium, the blood is going to go into the foramen ovale between the atria of the fetal heart and then go into the left atrium, left ventricle, and then through the aorta. However, since not all of the blood in the right atrium goes through the foramen ovale, some of it will go through the right ventricle and then up the pulmonary artery. So to prevent it from going through the pulmonary arteries and into the lungs, there's another shunt known as ductus arteriosus, which will allow any of the blood going into the pulmonary arteries to join the aorta so that most of the blood can be used for systemic circulation through the aorta and its branches. Now, after the oxygen in the partially oxygenated blood has been utilized by the fetus's tissues, the deoxygenated blood is going to be carried up by veins, and most of it will go back into the inferior vena cava. However, some of it will go through umbilical arteries and go back into the placenta to become oxygenated. So that concludes my explanation on how the fetal circulation works, and I hope this explanation was helpful. So as of now, we've looked at how the circulatory system in the fetus works and the shunts and structures involved. However, as you can imagine, after the fetus is born, it does not require these shunts and the foramen ovale anymore. So instead, these structures become closed off and form other structures in our bodies as remnants of this circulatory system that we once had when we were not yet born. So now I will go through what these structures become and what their names are. So for example, the ductus venosus becomes ligamentum venosum. The foramen ovale becomes fossa ovalis, and the ductus arteriosus becomes ligamentum arteriosum. So those are their shunts, and as you can imagine, we also do not require the umbilical artery or the umbilical veins because, well, we are no longer attached to a placenta. So the umbilical vein becomes ligamentum teres, and the umbilical arteries will become medial umbilical ligaments. And with that, I will conclude my explanation on the concept of fetal circulation. And I hope this video, along with the animation, was useful and provided a good explanation of the topic. Good luck and thank you for watching. Bye!